Synopsys is the leader in application security testing. With 84% of cyber attacks targeting the application layer, securing your software is more challenging than ever. Modern software development and deployment paradigms require security testing solutions that are automated, accurate, and integrate into your DevOps workflow. Synopsys enables DevSecOps with a portfolio of industry-leading tools, including Coverity, Black Duck, and Seeker, to help you build secure, high-quality software faster. Visit securityweekly.com/synopsys to learn more. Sysdig is the first cloud-native visibility and security platform that eliminates the need for standalone tools like container security and monitoring. Using Sysdig's unique data approach, enterprises can solve a variety of visibility and security issues at massive enterprise scale for multi- and hybrid cloud environments. Sysdig will enable your organization to scan and block vulnerable images and enforce best practices pre-production, block threats, enforce compliance, and monitor application performance, proactively alert on incidents, reduce MTTR with forensics, and capture detailed audit records, all from a single unified platform. Accelerate your transition to containers and then have confidence in your ongoing operations using Sysdig. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/Sysdig.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by Matt Alderman and John Kinsella. We've also kept Dave Ferguson around from the previous segment to help us through the news. Mark your calendars for our Security Weekly holiday extravaganza. On December 19th, Security Weekly will be live streaming 6 one-hour panel discussions with some of the most knowledgeable professionals in the industry. To round out the evening, Ed Skudis will be joining the Security Weekly hosts to give his annual announcement at the CounterHack Holiday Hack Challenge. You can view the live stream on our YouTube channel or by visiting securityweekly.com/live. We hope to see you there. Attend RSA Conference 2020 from February 24th through 28th and join thousands of security professionals, forward-thinking innovators, and solution providers for 5 days of actionable learning, inspiring conversation, and breakthrough ideas. Register before January 24th and save $900 on a full conference pass. Save an extra $150 by going to securityweekly.com/RSAC2020 and use our code to register. And with that, I'm going to say hi again to John, who did join us as promised. And John, I want to throw this over to you because we've got a bug here that I think caught your attention in a Firecracker and a buffer overflow in, drumroll please, Rust.
Yeah, this is a fun one. So yes, excuse everyone me for my tardiness when I came in a little late earlier. Yeah, so this is, and I think what I wanted to do is, it's another vulnerability, but this, is the day-to-day process. My coffee's still kicking in, so excuse my stuttering. As I go through my mail in the morning and I see new vulnerability, this one had just enough in there to catch my eye. I saw Firecracker. I'm like, oh, what's this? But I think what's interesting about this for our listeners is to sort of think through the process. You can actually have fun with this one, and for some value of fun. But there's some interesting and not interesting things about it. So I'll get the not interesting one out of the way first. It's another vulnerability in virt.io. We've seen plenty of those over the years, right? It's a lot of the issues we have with Linux kernels and generals nowadays tend to be around the device drivers, and hey, here we are again. And yeah, this is one thing that caught my interest was it's a vulnerability in Rust, or related to Rust, right? So usually I think people are starting to think about Rust as it's better than C because you have memory management and less pointer stuff and all these sort of great things. Doesn't necessarily mean you're not going to have buffer overflow. So might be a bit of a realization point to some people. But what was interesting to me then is I started digging a little bit deeper and deeper, and I think I might have done this earlier a few months ago in the podcast too, is as the game aspect of it, we got 2 links in the wiki. The second is directly into the release notes and the commits for this release. Start scrolling through there, see if you can figure out where the commit was done to actually fix the bug. Right, so start thinking a little bit, and it's interesting for a few different reasons. There's all sorts of signal analysis you can do in here. Which authors or committers are committing which types of code? So you're going to see some documentation commits in there. You'll see some feature improvements. You'll see a few where there's multiple people actually co-signing on a commit. You'll see different types of commits. Obviously there's going to be somewhere in this group there's the fix for this particular issue. There's other fixes to the virt.io code as well. But I think it's an interesting experiment to sort of go through from people who haven't thought about about this. Look and see how other people are doing their commit messages, right? It's you want some level of clarity and understanding so you can go back, as I always say, 3 o'clock in the morning. But then also you want the ability to, I really don't like obfuscating security commits. I like to make it sort of clear. I think the last one I talked about, probably back in June-ish, whenever it was, they actually said, hey, this is for this CVE, so they made it pretty clear. This one's a little tougher to spot, but I think that's sort of an interesting thing to look at, like, okay, not just how did they fix it, and not just a problem in Rust, but actually sort of understanding what's in there, when was it caught, how soon before the public announcement, and there's some homework questions there for people to go and play through and sort of get a sense of what's going on here.
No, that is really neat. I like that sense of homework, because I had a similar idea for one of our other links coming up. And I think to your point too, Rust, there's nothing here that says we should now throw out Rust because we found one vulnerability that, one type of anti-pattern that people could write. But I think it just points to the idea that people talk about having memory-safe languages, but we still don't quite have those programmer-safe languages. People can still make mistakes. People can still do those, call it an off by one, forgetting about, is this 8-bit, is this 16-bit, or what happens when those integer mismatches happen within, headers when you're pulling data off of the wire. So this was a pretty cool aspect to it. And I think the other thing is talking about committers, you also made me think too is, there's also something to be said there for when these items aren't called out as explicitly as security, researchers, bug bounty hunters could still be looking through commits and saying, well, was this just sort of a silent security fix, or an, perhaps not silent, but just a not drawn attention to, but maybe there's also something else in here that's worth poking around at. And there may be other vulnerabilities in this, code adjacent areas. So for those bug bounty researchers, pwn to own types of researchers, they're always looking at these types of commit histories.
And I think also we're going to come back to some other Amazon-related stuff. A few posts down here. I think that's in the backlog. No, it's in the notes. Cool. So people often talk about, open source, you're going to be giving away all your secrets. I think people know my thoughts on that. But I think what's interesting around this one is we think of, these code bases which are being run at these large public clouds, and so Firecracker was announced, beginning of the year? Or was it? No, it was last year at Reinvent. So it's a fairly new code base. For those who don't know, this is it's being used as it's a micro VM over at Amazon nowadays. So it's sort of a hypervisor. But so what's going on with, this is the code which is actually running a lot of virtual machines and production workloads. Was anyone poking around at this, or could someone actually take this now? Or, hey, I don't know if there's an exploit out for this. I don't think there is, but you can download Firecracker and run it. One of my devs has done it in the past. So maybe, if people want a chance to go and do some hacking and try their penetration testing skills, what can they do with this?
I think that's a great idea, and that gives me a good segue into the other vuln that I pulled out here that was called, I also love the term binary planting. We have binary planting, credential harvesting. These are much better phrases than the the OWASP top 10 has been coming up with. But in this case, it is one of my favorites, a directory traversal type of vulnerability. And so that's partially why I threw it in here, but it's also the write-up that I linked to from Daniel Ruff. It's a great way to point out that, as the write-up shows, it's a very simple and yet very elegant type of attack that just is applying some creative thinking to a packaged.json file, and then basically saying, hey, what can a ... do here, or a / do here? So, and it can lead to some high impact consequential problems. And so I'm more highlighting this as a point to Daniel's blog to read through the write-up of it. It's a great thought process of, here is a feature, how could I break the feature? And then what worse things can I do to this feature? As well as at the end, what are some of the ways to try to address this? And how much does this speak to other perhaps architectural issues and challenges that NPM has? So that's more what I wanted to focus on this aspect of it, in addition to sneaking in one final directory traversal bug in here. Speaking of, go ahead.
Well, just really briefly, this is something we've started seeing customers care about more and more over the last year, right? Is they're not just so much looking for they're not so much looking for, I'll say, security at the higher level, at the operating system or the container or the API, but actually starting to get down into the software packages. So it's important to think about these. It's very easy. We had on here 2 weeks ago, Alan Friedman, right, who was talking about thinking about our bill of materials and what's going on in there and how you keep track of the security of these things. And this is something to think about in relationship to that as well.
Yeah, it actually speaks to that idea of that software supply chain. And just because you're downloading an NPM that happens to do, can transform your English text into Pig Latin, if it also somehow has a directory traversal that can drop a binary that is a backdoored SSH or some other type of vulnerability, whatever the creativity of the hacker is, that's a liability to be aware of. And it's the idea of how much of a contract do we have with NPM and being sandboxed within our environment or within our container, and how much are those security boundaries a bit weaker perhaps than we were assuming. Real quick, just speaking of finding these bugs, this has been a year of, I think, honestly, HackerOne has been pushing on the marketing budget, but getting a lot of their customers, a lot of people talking about how much money is being spent on bug bounties. This time around, it's just a reference from GitLab. And one of the things, kind of as the meta conversation around this, I did want to highlight, is they were talking about a little over $500,000 that were doled out to around 171 researchers. But there's another stat in there that says, in the past year, the company received about almost 1,400 reports from 500 white hat hackers in that time. So that means that 500 hackers actually turned into 171 that actually got some type of money for their time spent. Now, obviously, some of that time spent may have been something on a silly type of vulnerability that's negligible risk or no risk whatsoever. It may have been a duplicate. But it's some of these interesting economics of what the bounty ecosystem looks like. And I just wanted to throw this out there as another data point to ponder.
Yeah, let's do some quick math here, though, so everybody understands what this actually means. So
right.
500 researchers, 171 got paid, which means 1/3. And the average payout was about $3,300. So again, these bug bounty programs are not going to make these researchers rich by any stretch of the imagination. I think the top award here was $20,000. Even again, you still have to have a day job in order to survive with some of these programs. I mean, the top number looks big, but again, it averages about $3,300 a submission.
Yeah. And so something to think about, and we'll continue to explore it, because I think one of the things that we, themes for us to also look into for the next year is how we spend our security budgets. Whether it should be SAST or DAST, like we were talking about just in the previous segment, or other types of tools, open source or commercial for that matter. But then, also in the vein of thinking about things, I wanted to call out this a presentation from AWS Reinvent from just a little bit ago that was about timing channels and multi-tenant computing. And actually, I think it's a really great presentation. And one of the things I wanted to highlight about it or kind of draw it to attention, because you can't really, it's a presentation you have to sit and listen through, but I do recommend doing so. You can't really skim an article about it. But as as listeners listening to this, consider as an exercise in threat modeling. Listen to those 4 questions. What are they building? So, Amazon obviously has a very multi-tenant cloud computing environment. They pioneered that. But what could go wrong? And that what could go wrong would be one of many side channel and timing attacks that we've talked here on ASW throughout, several months throughout this year. And then what are you going to do about it? And that 4th question, how did you do, or how effective was that countermeasure? And this is really great, having those questions in mind as you listen to this presentation and think about, what does multi-tenancy look like? How are they sharing cores or not sharing cores? How are they addressing either side channels they know about or potential side channels in the future, as well as measuring what are those impacts, because there is significant performance impacts in these engineering trade-offs. So I think all of that is a great like a tabletop exercise to go through with your developers and ask how would you agree with many of those decisions? Would you do some things differently? As well as maybe even in your own environments, DevSecOps teams, how much of this might apply to you?
This is your side channels, path traversals, and bug bounties, right?
Exactly. It's I'm sure I've got one more off to sneak in here. Just hold tight. But I think I'm not sure, John.
There's three articles all tied to the CICD and security, so we there's probably the next big topic for the year.
I'm not being subtle. You're right.
I was I forgot to put an article in here about the Intel Plunder Vault. I don't know if that was on your guys' radar. Not going to cover it here, but just to sort of bringing it back to this particular topic. For those who haven't heard about it, it's the ability to actually do some really interesting manipulation of an Intel CPU by modifying both the voltage and the clock frequency. So we've seen some of these recently. People starting to hook the function generators up to these chips and seeing what happens. But it'd be interesting to see what happens when you bring that back into a cloud provider like this. Or I don't know if you could launch that type of. You shouldn't be able to launch that type of an attack from a guest VM, but still sort of interesting to think about. I thought this was I haven't got a chance to watch the actual video itself, but just the fact that they're talking about side channels so openly and how they're dealing with it and what they are thinking about it. Nice to see that out there.
Yeah, and I think it's just great too, just to really, I guess, maybe I'm beating the dead horse now, but it's sort of that idea going through threat modeling exercises and talking with developers and DevOps teams about how to think through security. I think this is one great example of doing that. In addition to being, an interesting topic, even though it might be pretty narrowly focused and not, universally applicable to all the types of applications that are out there. But with that said, there are certain things that are applicable to all the DevOps team and DevSecOps teams, and these are the pipelines and CICD. And so one of the articles I pulled out, this was a post on Medium that was a pretty good summary, I might say, of a lot of the aspects that we've talked about throughout the year, and a lot of good pointers and diagrams to resources. So this is sort of just kind of saying, it is asking the question without necessarily answering it with too many specifics, but just where should we put security within these pipelines? And we talked with Dave in the previous segment about some of the customers using Jenkins and launching scans with the API. So launching API security scans through the API that the scanner provides. So it could be purely automated. And that's just obviously one small thing in addition to then we were just talking about bugs and breaches, supply chain. So how do we do dependency tracking? And so this I thought was a really great article just to as a refresher of the several domains that are important for considering pipeline security.
Yeah, I got a bunch of comments on this one. First, one of the challenges, this is why, Dave, I asked you the question specifically, is this whole skill set gap issue, right? From a security development perspective. And I think we see challenges on both sides, right? The DevOps teams not really understanding security, but the security teams really not understanding DevOps, right? And I think it's going to be an interesting trend to see how developers take on more security roles because they understand how to develop code, they understand the CI/CD pipeline, and therefore, if they are really interested in security, I think they could be in a really good position to actually help secure a lot of this code coming through these new DevOps pipelines. So first, I want to get your comments on that, and then I got a couple more on this article. Did we lose Dave?
Did we lose Dave? Uh-oh. Too many.
I think I was on mute. Am I back?
There we go.
Yeah, okay. There you are.
Yeah, so Matt, one of the things that a lot of organizations are doing is adopting a security champions model where in the development organization, you find developers that may have shown an interest in security. And that way you have developers kind of embedded in all the different dev teams. Since the security can't be everywhere at once, this security champions model seems to be kind of gaining some traction. So that and it's it's an official role. Not that they would get paid any extra, but it's it's something that you would reach out to people in the development organization, find those that might be interested in learning about security, contributing to the security of the software at the organization, and then having maybe some training sessions, monthly meetings, and then just having them be sort of boots on the ground in the DevOps or the DevOps and dev organization.
Yeah, and this is where I want to see the industry continue to come together, right? Because I think that's the real advantage. That's how we ultimately get to this concept of DevSecOps. Without that cross understanding of the two, it's just a huge challenge. I mean, there's tons of articles. There's a couple more in here that talks about just some of the challenges of security in the overall CI/CD pipeline. So I agree with you. The second thing I wanted to cover in here is this is actually a pretty good roadmap from an integration perspective of the different steps: unit testing, SAST, DAST. The one I have to hit on, and you guys know this because this is the other big theme this year, is stop giving up root in your containers. This whole privileged container security thing, just stop it. My Lord, this drives me nuts, right? We should not be giving up root in our containers. And there's a whole section on privileged container security. No, don't give up root. And if we did that, it would streamline things. Now, monitoring the container in runtime, I think, is an extremely important component. It kind of overlaps into the runtime piece, but this whole privilege piece in the container side is just a big no-no that we need to get our arms around. And my last question, my last piece, and this is a question for all of you, is are we still seeing a lot of runtime application self-protection rollouts in a containerized microservice architecture, or is Rasp, or the concept of Rasp, getting harder to actually achieve?
Well, remember, Matt, what was it, probably 2 years ago when Gartner was saying that Rasp was about to take off?
Yeah.
Still waiting for it. So
me too. Yeah.
I'm seeing it a little bit still, but yeah, I'm not sure if it's not fulfilling the promise, or if the consumers just aren't going to buy that story. But yeah, I'm not seeing a lot of it.
See, one of the challenges I had with Rasp was that it's very language specific. And if you think about a microservice-based architecture where I can literally run any language and multiple languages, Rasp had some challenges. I felt it was at the wrong level, at the language level versus maybe at the container level, which is why I kind of, that's why at Layered Insight, I felt we had a better opportunity to protect the container regardless of the language versus a runtime application self-protection. I've seen some good solutions out there, don't get me wrong, that tie WAF and Rasp together in a very unique way that gives a lot of the contextual information from the running application to actually protect at the WAF level. But if I think about Rasp by itself, I think that gets really difficult to implement and manage across a very diverse application.
Were you going to chime in, Dave?
There's definitely some wariness out there about deploying Rasp in production. False positives, performance is still going to be a concern. And then I also like to touch on one other aspect. Matt mentioned the microservice architecture being a challenge for Rasp. The microservice architectures are also becoming a big challenge for the full-blown SAST testing approaches, because if you have a monolithic web application, say a Struts application, a SAST approach is going to work very well. But as soon as you have a microservice architecture where everything's a little API call across the network, how does the SAST tool do the control flow analysis, the data flow analysis across all these API calls? It just becomes very challenging. So Rasp, I agree, Rasp is not taken off yet. And then I think the SAST testing approach seems like every year is becoming less and less relevant. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. I haven't really heard anyone else kind of mention this yet, but it's something that I worked at Veracode for a while, and there's some applications that it worked very well on for binary static analysis, and others it didn't. And it was a microservice-based application. It's just really challenging.
Yeah, and I think that's where the container security scanners come into play and this whole software composition analysis component, right? If I'm doing binary scanning, I'm using my SCA tools to do this, understand what libraries, binaries are in there, which vulnerabilities apply. Do I need a full SAST? Now, if I'm doing custom code, there's probably still some value in doing static analysis for that custom source code. But to your point, Dave, doing it on a large scale maybe isn't possible anymore just because we don't have these big monolithic applications in a microservice architecture. And therefore, what's the real value of SAST and all these little scans? I still think there's some validity, but maybe not to the same level as we used to see back in the old days when we had a big, tar ball that we just kind of plopped on a server and called it an app.
I agree with you. SCA is hugely important. And then also the fact that I lost my point. Okay. So I'll tell you one thing: security spell checkers in an IDE that can catch a lot of things that a full-blown SAST will report. Like, let's say a developer uses MD5 in their code. That would get flagged by like a Fortify or a Veracode, but that could also get flagged by a security spell checker type solution in an IDE as the developer is actually typing that code. So a combination of SCA and the security spell checker, I think, can cover a very large part of what the full-blown SaaS solutions could do.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and I think that aligns a lot with more my thinking on that Rasp Apps aspect, because I've seen it mostly just talked about because it is so language specific, Java and .NET, but Java and .NET are clearly not the only languages out there being used to build applications. And I followed a little bit more philosophically on that idea of what can be done within the language in the first place, or just like you were saying, Dave, in the IDE, and moving a lot of that security in the IDE to get the attention of the developer in these problem areas and have them fix it, rather than assume that there is going to be bad code. Rasp will, dynamically, virtually address that bad code, and then you have to figure out how to fix it, at some point later on. I love that idea of that spell checker, that little red squiggly line underneath, that MD5 or some other function or some other, software pattern that looks a little bit off that should be addressed. And so that's where I was thinking that I think that's one of the hurdles, or maybe not a hurdle, but one of the competitors that Rasp has is just the maturity of IDEs and richer security information feedback coming to developers right as they're writing code.
And I don't know about Dave from his previous life, but I know when, when I was doing code analysis, I kept my cheat sheet of things to grep for in the code base. So creating at least the initial versions of that spell checker, it seems like something should be fairly easy to do. I don't know if they're out there. The last time I looked, I didn't see anything great, but maybe things have improved.
There's some commercial spell checkers that plug into the IDE that I think are pretty mature at this point.
Okay.
And Facebook has some interesting open source work in this area too, where you can build up the AST for a handful of different languages, and then rather than just grep through text, you can actually do some semantic grepping through the codes, and that's also a lot more helpful. So you can figure out, look for this function or look for this parameter or this other data type, rather than just treating all of your files as text. So I think there's some, to your point, John, grep I think is still pretty darn effective, and we haven't really replaced it, in a way that can get rid of grep being useful.
That'll be my next startup.
There you go. But I think back to that article, though, it does, I think, a really good job breaking down the different areas that security and DevOps need to work on from an integration of security checks into the CICD pipeline. It kind of takes 3 articles and kind of rolls it all together. Just be cautious that certain ones, like SAST, may not be as effective as it used to be, and Rasp may not be as effective as it used to be, and stop giving up root in your containers, and you'll be in a better position. But it does give a pretty good blueprint, which I thought was interesting.
And then one more thought on this. Sorry,
Go ahead.
While we're babbling, I've clicked through to there's a link to a DigitalOcean. What is this, anyways? Am I reading? It's the state of open source, a blog post from Dio that's on a link in that article, And it's really interesting. It's quite long, but some of the findings they have around, like, what do people think about different providers to open source? In other words, are corporations good or bad? Who's the better which companies they like better or worse? Are women happy? Do they feel inclusive? Different parts of the world. So there's a really interesting article clicked behind that also for those playing along at home.
Cool. I think, yeah. So as we said, so some great information there and resources just to dive into from that particular article. And then to Matt, to your point, that's information, but put some metrics behind it. Meaning, how much risk are you reducing, and are these tools that you're integrating being effective? And that was you've been talking quite rightly about the integration aspects, a lot of the technical aspects. This other article about using CICD to turn ideas into software quickly also touches on, and it uses the term soft skills, but I want to reframe that into basically interpersonal skills and communication skills. And that means also what Dave had mentioned too about security champions, finding the developers who are predisposed to security or have an interest in security, talk with them and start to build up their skills, and also have discussions with the DevOps team about what security you're integrating into the pipeline and how you're doing it and why. And those discussions often it's one thing to have those discussions. It's another thing, and this article kind of alludes to about how to have those discussions, meaning setting aside egos and focusing on what are the technical decisions here? What are we trying to reduce? Are we really giving up root in our container, or is there actually a way that we can make UID 0 not have to go into, be granted to that container? As well as we've talked in previous episodes about postmortem. So let's say, when something does go bad, that a concept of a blameless postmortem, and the idea that, did a person make a mistake? Was there a flaw in the process that fell down here? Was there a problem within tooling that fell down here? These are all tie into, I think, what that was alluding to, and not using a great term, but was talking about soft skills in that aspect of that article, to making, the people aspect of that CI/CD pipeline.
Yeah, because DevSecOps is never going to happen until the two sides start to talk, and it's a communication. It's a conversation. It's an understanding of what each side is trying to accomplish and find a way to make it work. We'll never get to this concept of DevSecOps if security sits on one side saying this is the way it's going to be, and DevOps is sitting on the other side saying, look, the business is going to push me to move forward. Unless you come together and figure this out, which requires good communication skills and the ability to work through problems together, we'll never get there as an industry. It just won't.
No, and we're getting short on time, and I want to make sure we've got two more articles to get through about going passwordless and why security may be missing in many DevOps implementations. I think we can tie them together, so I want to dive into the passwordless thing first, because Dave, I have a question for you. So there's an article here from Microsoft that's basically describing how to essentially not have passwords. But one of the things I don't think and I think these are great. So you can have, like YubiKeys, FIDO keys, or the WebAuthn protocol. All these are great steps forward. But one of the things that's often missing is that possibly we could fix the password problem and get rid of passwords or improve on them. But what about the account recovery aspect of this? I think that aspect really hasn't been emphasized as much. And Dave, I'm bringing this up because you were actually involved in a cheat sheet around the passwords for OWASP. So what are some of your thoughts on this article?
Yeah, I may have to put some thought into that, Mike. But it was 10 years ago that actually I wrote a white paper when I was at Fishnet called Best Practices for a Secure Forgot Password Feature, because I was pen testing all these applications, and every single application did it a different way, and some were more secure than others, and some used email, and some used one-time passwords, and there was no standard. So I kind of picked and chose what I thought were some of the best things from what I saw, and I did this white paper, and then Jim Anico and OWASP kind of picked up on that, and we ended up doing a cheat sheet for OWASP about that. But back at that time, there really wasn't these initiatives that you mentioned, which are definitely good initiatives, and probably a lot of thought put behind them. But have any of them thought about the password recovery, forgot password situation? But if there's no password, what needs to be recovered?
Right. And this article gets a lot into biometrics, right? And we've talked a lot about some of the challenges with biometrics, where they're stored, how they're secured. So let's say biometrics get stolen. How do you reset a biometric? I don't think you can you? I mean, there's actually implications here that get interesting in the way they've structured this article to say the way to get rid of passwords is you go all biometric and you store the credentials up in the cloud, but wait, they're also stored on the local devices potentially. What happens if they get stolen? Is there a way to reset them? There's a lot of challenges here that you don't have with passwords.
Yeah, I think the iPhones and Apple has been very focused on the protection around that. So all of the security decisions about the storage is actually is in those secure enclaves and on device and not sent to the cloud. In addition to but on the cloud side of things, you also then have like Google, who offers, I think it's advanced protection, which can be basically they say get 2 hardware keys, and we're going to add a lot of restrictions on your G Suite accounts, your Gmail accounts, how it can interact with other services, how OAuth tokens can be provisioned for it, and it's going to be a rather onerous process that if you lose or those hardware keys are lost, stolen, what have you, it's going to be an onerous process to get access back to your accounts. But that is an upfront trade-off that they are in fact being pretty explicit about, saying that we think you are a journalist or an activist or working in human rights or something else, where we think you're going to be targeted and need some advanced protection like this, but it's going to come at that cost of usability, and ease of use in case you lose access to your account because you don't have a specific device or what have you.
Yes. Security versus usability. Here we go again.
Security versus usability, and that could be maybe one, not the only, I think, of course, but maybe one of the reasons security is missing in DevOps implementations, and that takes us just to our final article of this segment. And some of it talks about that Medium article we were talking about before, just knowing where to integrate, when to integrate. Talking about education and training, I think that really goes back to that idea of security champions and adopting that. It's a tough thing because, as David pointed out, congratulations, you're a security champion. There's no bump in pay for this. But that's part also why it can tend to hopefully appeal to people who are interested in security and want to expand their skill set, as well as some other interesting bullet points that this particular article is calling out.
Yep. Yeah, it's just an interesting article. Like I said, it kind of ties into the other two of some of the challenges from cultural resistance to skill set gaps to integration of the different processes and the tools together. It's just it's just part of that three article series in this show that kind of bring it all together and say, look, if we're going to achieve DevSecOps, as I said before, these are some of the things we have to deal with.
Exactly. And I think one of the things the article didn't mention, that if we're going to achieve DevSecOps, we should also be listening to Application Security Weekly. So if there's any message for the year, that's mine. Well, any final thoughts, Matt, Dave, John, on any of the topics we covered so far in this segment?
I don't think so. For me, I think we're all in sort of wrapping up the year mode, and yeah, I think it's at least what's on my mind now is what's 2020 bringing in, and how do we improve a lot of these things. So that's sort of my next few weeks.
Absolutely. And we've got the Security Weekly Holiday Extravaganza coming up on the 19th. And I think that will give us more wrap up of the year, as well as a lot of those, what John was just saying, a lot of things to think about for 2020 and what you can look forward to from Application Security Weekly. So I want to say thanks to Matt, thanks to John, special thanks to Dave for joining us for both segments this time. And thanks everyone for listening. We will thank you for joining us. We will see you again next year on Application Security Weekly.